I welcome you all for APLC's ninth webinar of this series and a very special webinar. I am Advocate Anand Kumar, practicing in Delhi High Court. On behalf of our team, AP Legal Chambers, and on my personal behalf, I welcome you all for this one-of-a-kind webinar. The webinar of today is titled Understanding Laws and Legal Proceedings of the Imperial Chola Period via Case Study and comparing them with present laws by our special speaker, Professor Madhusudanan Kalaichelvan, architect and art enthusiast. I sincerely thank you all for the overwhelming response for the event. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of its kind, the first event where an architect and a person who is well versed in temple conservation and preservation is collaborating with an advocate or a law firm. We are here to analyze, understand the legal proceedings and the laws at the time of Cholas, Imperial Cholas, and with the contemporary laws. Since we are receiving a good response from the audience for all our webinars, it only makes us work harder and harder for each webinar, with each passing webinar. We owe the entire credit of this to our special speaker, Professor Madhusudanan, as we are just facilitating by providing a stage for the special speaker to connect with the audience and vice versa. For all those who are regularly attending our webinars, I am sure you might be knowing us. For those who have come here for the first time, we are Team AP Legal Chambers, a new age law firm in Delhi and NCR with its branch office in Chennai. We started our journey in 2017 with the vision of providing plenary services to our clients and to resolve their legal issues. Our portfolios cover a broad spectrum of specialized services, including domestic and international taxation, constitutional laws, IPR, energy law, commercial advisory, arbitration, and corporate compliances. We started hosting webinars out of our passion for law, and due to the tremendous response from the participants, we are organizing the webinars on every Thursdays and Sundays. As you all know, once the presentation of the special speaker gets over, we shall be having this APLC's APLC, Ask the Popular Learned Counsel. We have prepared a few questions from our end and would be asking our special speaker to answer them. I am sure it will be both entertaining and informative. Dear participants, we have in our midst special speaker Professor Madhusudanan Kalaichelvan, an art enthusiast. He is an architect by profession and he is an architect graduate and a gold medalist in his post-graduation. He specializes in conservation and architectural research. He has been in academics for around a decade now, mentoring students of popular schools of architecture. An active heritage enthusiast, his contributions have earned him the coveted Vedavalli Memorial Award for outstanding service by a young achiever in the field of South Indian heritage. He is well versed in the fields of art, architecture, heritage, cultural studies, and vernacular practices. A popular speaker on a wide range of topics associated with heritage, religion, and literature. He has over 200 hours of YouTube content to his credit. This shows his dedication and hard work. He is currently pursuing his doctoral research on temple town planning and also serves on government instituted panel for conservation of temples in Tamil Nadu. He is also a recent recipient of the title Ilakkiya Chemmal, recognizing his mastery over Tamil literature. He curates and conducts tours to places of architectural and cultural importance. Due to the want of time, I am just finishing the bio of our special speaker. This runs to pages, but I am sure we will be more than happy to hear whatever content he has got. I welcome our special speaker, Professor, on board. I am also eagerly waiting for his speech to have a clarity on this particular topic. Welcome to APLC's webinar. The special highlight of this topic would be we would be interacting with the special speaker, and as and when he concludes the case study of a particular case. So this is going to be a very, very interactive session, and all the participants are requested to leave the questions in the chat box if they have any, and our special speaker would be happy to answer all your questions. Thank you, and I welcome our professor. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Anandji, for that wonderful introduction. And let me get started. We're already running late a bit. So the talk for today is titled as Understanding Law and Legal Proceedings of the Imperial Chola Period via Case Studies and Comparing Them with Recent Law. A couple of terms used in the title to be given a clarity about. So the Imperial Cholas, we're very particular about that term, calling them as the Imperial Chola, because the Cholas as a monarch have been very popular and ruling. The Imperial Chola, the Cholas have been a very powerful monarch controlling various different parts of South India, and there has been difference in the regional boundary and other things. The Sangam period is academically from the 3rd century before Common Era to the 3rd century in Common Era. That's roughly 2,300 years back, 2,700 years. So that's the 600-year slot in between is academically referred to as the Sangam period. So we find enough references about the Cholas, the wars that they fought, their bravery, valor, and all that, starting from that period. And they have been powerful on and off. And between you had the Pandyas, who were also powerful. The Pallavas rose to power on one side, and the Cholas around the 6th, 7th century were nothing but a small, a narrow stretch of region ruling monarch sandwiched between the mighty Pallavas in the north and the Pandyas in the south. Then around 9th, 10th century, things changed. The Cholas managed to bring the Pandyas under their control and went on to fight against the Pallavas, brought them also under their control. And starting from around the 9th century, that's when the Imperial Chola period generally starts. And thanks to their interest in documentation, they have got all their moves, all their important moves, well documented for us to understand them best. That's why instead of depending on literature and other aspects, which are of course secondary tools to understand history, we prefer going by the inscriptional proofs. There again, there have been recent additions to new finds. For example, generally when we talk about the Cholas and their contribution, the first and the most authentic source to start with is the works of Sri K. Nilakanta Shastri, a doyen when it comes to the Cholas, an authority when it comes to the Cholas, in all aspects of Cholas. So we generally follow him. But several decades after his time, around the 70s, a new set of copper plates were discovered in a place called Isalam in Tamil Nadu, which throws more light into areas that weren't that clear initially. So as it goes on, these new finds also help us learn more. This period between the 10th to the end of 13th century, mid of 13th century, a little after mid of 13th century, when the Cholas, the Cholas who were ruling and all this that got documented, and the times when they had set a very powerful naval fleet and went in all possible directions through all possible routes to wage wars, bring various countries under their control and establish the Chola rule is what is called as the Imperial Chola period. Of course, the most prominent kings are Rajaraja and Rajendra, as we understand, because of their contributions in all fields, political, social, cultural, religious, arts, and all that. So these two kings are like prominent, and mostly the legal systems that we get to see starts predominantly from this period. The understanding becomes more clearer from this period. But what is to be understood here is, all of a sudden around the 10th, 11th century, a matured outlook on legal systems and judgments and conducting courts and all that wouldn't have fallen all of a sudden. So these things have been in place, maybe not up to this level, but something close to this. So models that look like courts and all that should have got into practice several centuries before that. Unfortunately, we don't have enough documentation about it. We do have documentation that, but not as much as or as detailed as what we get in the Imperial Chola period. One reason why we chose that particular phase in Tamil history for today's session. And the Cholas, in all their copper plates where they speak, where they introduce themselves, their lineage, starting from the sun god and bringing it down. And the first and foremost king they always salute to is none but Manu himself. And it starts from there. Ikshvaku comes in the lineage. So does Rama himself. So does Sri Chakravarti and all of them. And so their proclamation time and again to uphold justice and to uphold justice the way Manu did it. Or in a few cases, they go on to say, I am 3 or 4 times more particular about justice than Manu himself. To quote exactly, Manuvinukku mummadi nalmadiyam solan. This particular Chola king, whoever it is referring to, says that I am 3 or 4 times better when it comes to the way the Dharmashastras were upheld by Manu. Then he says, I rule with the torch that Manu had given me. I walk the way with the help of that knowledge in Dharmashastras and Smritis that Manu has given me. So to follow the path as laid by Manu is time and again what they say. But while we have different versions of Manu Shastras and all that in today's case, as approved from the Smritis and brought in, and there are commentators and all that, if we take case by case and analyze, we might have to see that we might be surprised to see that the Smritis as proclaimed by Manu, or the judgments or the legal suggestions as given by Manu is not what has been exactly followed to the point. So let's get ourselves equipped with a little on the legal system as it existed before getting into the specific cases. The Chola lineage, of course, out of all their kings who are spoken about in detail in various literature, and the kings that the Cholas themselves mention about as their ancestors in their copper plates includes one, Manunidi Cholan, a Chola king who did not spare the life of his own son when he came to know that his son drove a chariot and a cow was killed in it, and a calf was killed. So the cow comes to the court and brings the issue up. When the king comes to know that it was his own son who had done it, he said, let me face the same anguish that the cow is undergoing. So he went on to ride the chariot on his son. And of course, later on, all this gets to a close with the divine intervention, and Shiva appears and proves to the world how justice has been upheld by the Chola kings. So Manunidi Cholan is one important king. Then we of course have the Sri Chakravarti also, from whom the title of Shendiyan comes in, and the Cholas call themselves as Shendiyans too. So we all know how Shibi considered the plea by birds. A bird, in fact, gave it refuge and went on to support it and didn't mind giving up his own life. So this is how the Cholas, their ancestors, as going by themselves, the descriptions that they have given, the ancestors of the Chola kings, imperial Cholas, this is exactly how they have upheld justice. And to understand about the legal systems, predominantly, apart from, because the Chola country as such, especially during the peak period in the imperial slot, kind of extended in northeast and south, west, in all possible directions. Almost major parts of the whole of South India, major parts of today's Odisha and central India up to Gujarat and all that, and into West Bengal. So that stretched completely there, and up until the southern banks of Ganga. So all of this was under their control, especially during Rajendra's time. Of course, they crossed the oceans, went to the other countries, away, islands, and all that has been brought under the Cholas' control. Several countries today that we see as parts of Southeast Asian subcontinent was under their control. Given such a huge land mass to rule, it becomes quite challenging in those days, with a lot of restrictions over communications and transportation, to follow one particular code book that kind of becomes the general rule for the whole country. So for the ease of administration, predominantly majority of the cases that were brought up for justice were met out in what were called as the sabhas, that were more like the village assemblies. And when it comes to classification of settlements in any village, there were 2 different settlements that we see time and again in the inscriptions. One is referred to as the Chaturvedi Mangalams, which were exclusively for the Brahmin community, for the Brahmins, the learned Brahmins, who held control over the laws within that boundary, but their jurisdiction was more within the Chaturvedi Mangalam. We had yet another settlement dominated by the agriculturists, members from the agricultural communities, along with whom several other communities who existed as a part of it. We see references to community-based settlements in several inscriptions. So, and these are referred to as Ur. So you had the Chaturvedi Mangalams and Ur as 2 different entities, and people who were scholars, who were learned from all other communities, find representation in the body that went on to administer the Ur part of it also. The most important inscription when it comes to the assembly and all that, time and again quoted by many scholars, is the inscription in a place called Uttarameru from the times of Parantaka Chola, a couple of generations before Rajaraja, where a detailed inscription runs to several lines, speaks about the qualifications for a person to contest in the local body election. Election was, of course, by a ballot, that was there, but in order to contest in it, a set of prerequisites were imposed. Be understood that this election procedure, which is well documented and that we have got in hand, is pertaining to a Chaturvedi Mangalam. So the prerequisites included belonging to a particular Veda which they have learned, or the equivalent parts to it is at least a few Samhitas. So you should have memorized this, and there is a list of prerequisites that goes into it as your qualificational a mandate that was required by the individual to prove himself to contest, fit enough to contest. And owning a house there, land there, being regular with the taxes, no default, and a person from the same family, once he gets elected to be a part of it, none of his blood relatives can go into it for the next 3 or 4 terms. So all of this were put up. So they shouldn't have had any criminal offenses committed, no records like that. So a list, in fact. So this was more for the Chaturvedi Mangalam. So the qualifications were also based on that. Now this is one inscription which pertains to one particular Chaturvedi Mangalam in Uttarameru. Now going on to an extent to think that every Chaturvedi Mangalam and every Ur had a detailed qualification process is left up to the person who wants to take it that way. And there are also people say that this should have differed and needn't necessarily be that it was the common case everywhere. This is the only place where we get a detailed list of qualifications expected out from a person who wants to contest. That aside, now there are similar qualifications which are put forward for people who want to constitute the General Assembly Administrative Committee of a Ur or the settlement that involves various other castes, and representatives from there were from various communities. We find references to a few inscriptions where people even belonging to the several communities being a part of it. That includes agriculturists, activities, occupations that supported agriculture, craftsmen, businessmen, washermen, all of them in various different inscriptions we see them. And when it comes to a court scene and they had to debate and when it was time for judgment, people belonging to various different communities, that is a very lengthy cross-section in fact chosen, and it's not from what is generally called as the socially upper class community all the way down to the socially lower class. So representations from various different communities have stood witness to complicated cases depending upon the nature of the case. So when needed, people from different communities were brought in, and in some cases, people who constituted the assembly panel as such belong to various communities. So a general opinion that it was always dominated by a certain section of society is completely, it is to be dismissed. It's not a fact. So two different systems for two different requirements and people from various different communities representing it. That's one point. Secondly, and to believe that all of this started during the Chola period also is wrong, because we find references to court scenes and other things starting from even the Pandya period, which preceded the Cholas by a couple of centuries. This inscription, particular inscription from a place called Manu in South Tamil Nadu, has a direct reference to a existence of a similar panel and the prerequisites, the qualifications one needs to satisfy to be a part of the panel, and all that starts from there itself. There are also references to prison breaks. So the concept that prisons existed and a few people were actually arrested and thrown into the jail is established. May not be very mighty prisons, and for all cases, prison was not the only solution. For cases like people who went on to create kind of a political unrest within the society, or people who went on to kill members of the royal family. So references to prison breaks and other things comes in, but awarding a punishment for a person to be jailed is not a very common aspect. But for very severe mistakes committed, jail was not a very popular way for punishment. So these village assemblies were extremely powerful. There are very, very few cases wherein an appeal for a higher court is recorded, and interference directly from someone as powerful as the king himself or a minister by the command of the king and all that is very minimum. So we can be assured that the village assemblies by both these social denominations were extremely powerful, and the concept of appeal nearly didn't exist, but for very, very severe issues. Next, the concept of appointing an advocate to defend yourself does not seem to have existed, only because in all the cases, mostly it was the person who was accused. It was on him to prove himself not guilty and come out of it. But if he is proven guilty, of course, he is, he's given all the punishments that are prescribed. And the punishment does not seem to be the same everywhere. Let's take something very common as a murder. So every murder happening, even for the same reasons, the person who is killed might belong to the same gender, same social demographic, same social background and all that. But the punishment given need not necessarily be same. There have been very exclusive cases that though the offender was a person who belonged to the agricultural community, so the local court feels that because he's an agriculturist and mostly he propagates non-violence, a person who's been serving the society through his profession, all that. So let us consider this not let's consider corporal punishment like to slain him off or kill him as justice as a judgment to the case presented. This case is very exclusive, wherein a person from the agricultural community murders another Kshatriya community man, and this comes up for an inquiry, and the court there discusses, debates over it, and finally feels, given the fact that he belongs to an agricultural, his profession and his community, and he's been serving all this, and his track records have been clean all these years, his family, his ancestors have been working towards the betterment of the settlement. Considering all that, let's not award a death penalty. So this is what is proclaimed. So not necessary that all cases were conducted the same way, or for the same offense committed, it was always the same judgment. That is also there. And mentions of a special committee called as the Nyayatta or the Nyaya Bhattas in these kind of judgmental epigraphs gives us a clue that there was also a committee, probably a subcommittee that was invited only when there were special requirements to sit and argue and finally help the judges pronounce the judgment and support it with other cases. Seldom there are references to precedences, speaking that a similar case happened elsewhere, so we are giving the same judgment. There are very, very few occurrences like that. And this kind of a court might sound more like a kangaroo court for us today, but given the situation that it was within a very small settlement, the population which was well documented, everybody knew each other and their track records and all that, it was very easy for them to go ahead with the functioning of a court like this. In most cases, even for offenses like a murder or causing someone to commit suicide and all that, were treated, and the punishment given were something as simple as paying or creating an endowment in the local temple to burn perpetual lamps. This concept of burning perpetual lamps seems to be the most preferred punishment offered, because there is a financial implication in it. And going by a simple math that we can do by available data, to burn one perpetual lamp, you will have to create an endowment or donate 32 cows to a temple. You can imagine the financial aspect that comes along with it. So that's more like a penalty that way. And to ensure that it continues always, because it's a perpetual lamp, the concept that way. Or the other equivalent is giving 96 goats or 64 buffaloes. These are the various choices for one to pick from, and the numbers dependent on the quantity of oil that can be produced to burn a lamp in the temple. So concept of further appeal does not seem to be there. Concept of employing advocates to defend you does not seem to be there. Existence of record rooms is there, because there are cases where people speak about how records were cross-checked when it comes to, for example, the very popular story of one of the greatest devotees of Shiva. One of the earliest references to a courtroom scene as such in literature is that of Sundaramurti Nayanar, one of the canonized devotees of Shiva, as to how Shiva wanted to bless him, to bring him into the fold of Shaivite religion. So on the day of his wedding, Shiva walks into, as a mendicant walks inside the wedding hall, commands to stop the wedding and says that this groom here, all ready to get married, cannot get married because his grandfather has struck the contract with me. He is given it in writing that he and people in his lineage are all slaves to me. So he presents the deed of slavery and says he cannot get married. Then this scene shifts over to the local court, where again Shiva argues for himself, but Sundara says that he is not even aware of something like this and he is innocent. Neither does his father know of existence of a contract like this, a contract for slavery like that by his grandfather. And then Shiva produces the original document, which is cross-checked with the documents that were available in the native place. All that, and finally they say it is pretty convincing that your grandfather has given a deed like this, so you will have to go with him. And then, of course, Shiva disappears in the local temple, and there is a divine echo which says that it was all my game to bring you into the fold. And from now on, you are one of my devotees, and your duty is to propagate the religion. And he goes on a pilgrimage, and the rest is history. So, existence of such courtrooms, where there were also record rooms, handwritings of people and signatures were maintained, and all that is seen. Generally, any royal command is documented in three means. One is the king himself will have his royal scribe who will document it in palm leaf manuscripts as the king orders directly. And this, depending on its importance, is circulated to various places. And wherever it is a royal command that needs to be engraved, the local temple walls are used as boards to engrave these. And if it is something even more important about a huge donation given or otherwise, there is also a concept of documenting the same thing in copper plates and getting that gifted to the person who is involved. So that's like more copies of it is made with the royal seal on it. And there are several popular copper plates that were discovered and that have been discovered in the recent past also that has helped us understand the Chola history the more academic fashion. So that is a very generic view of it. And this first part of the talk, I finish off quoting K. Nilakanta Shastri. He says, it's remarkable how little the presence of the supernatural is allowed to intrude into the account of the crime. So there doesn't seem to be an occasion in all these legal proceedings where word of gods or all that has been pulled in. But you can be assured that the people who sat as judges had their credentials proven, and they were completely, they had their own conscience and they were truthful, at least to themselves. And mostly it was easy to run the show because it didn't involve a huge population, and crime rates were very minimum. And quite surprisingly, there is not even one record which speaks about something like rape or similar physical abuse. While there are cases where a woman has committed suicide, which we'll be seeing now, but concept of rape or other things does not seem to have recorded. So by and large, we don't see anything directly talking about something as offensive as rape. So with that introduction, I'm getting into presenting 6 different cases. So as I present the broad outlay of the case, I'd be happy if Anandji can come in and discuss how it would be viewed in today's legal perspectives. Then I'll say how the judgment that has been proclaimed by the in the actual case. Now, the first record is about a theft in the temple. I'm taking 6 cases. All of these are predominantly, all of these are from the 12th and the 13th century, but for the last one, that is from Rajaraja's time. So the first 5 are from the 12th and 13th century. Times when the Cholas have really become extremely powerful, well established, huge part of this part of the world was being ruled by them and all that. So the first case is an interesting temple theft case. There is a temple in a place called Tirukazhakundram in the outskirts of Chennai city, an age-old temple popular from the times of Pallava kings, sanctified by the divine hymns of the Nayanmars who visited it way back in the 7th century. It's a 2-part temple. One is on a hillock, and there is one in the foothills also. So the huge temple found a lot of, there were a lot of endowments created starting from the Pallava period. So there are records for that. And in this temple, in the treasury, there is a theft. A couple of people who were involved in it, 2 of them were well-trained thieves. One is the person who was put in charge as a security guard for the treasury himself, and the 4th is the temple priest. All 4 of them, hand in gloves, went on to break the seal, go in, theft was done, they came out, again sealed the locks because there was one person from the temple administration and one security guard and all of them involved. It was completely sealed, and this is it, it gets over there. And during the when the time comes to open the treasury to bring some jewelry of the deity out, people discover that a theft has happened. Unfortunately, by that time, the temple priest has, probably his conscience hurt him and he dies. Then the 2 thieves have disappeared. And this happens in the Chola period. And because the thieves, one person who is committed is dead and the thieves have disappeared and only the security guard was caught, he was punished, but the temple jewels were still missing. So this goes on to a couple of decades later. This is reopened, the case is reopened, and family members of these two thieves were caught. Their property were confiscated and deposited in the temple treasury. So this is the case as it happened. Now I'd like Anandji to probably throw some light on it and explain, help us understand how this is being met out in today's context.
Thank you, Professor, for the wonderful introduction about the topic and also about the case study. The first case which you have mentioned relates to theft. I think once I was going through this theft related matter, I found one interesting case, which is also a 27-year-old case. The judgment was given 27 years after the theft happened.
Okay.
This one was given by the first judicial magistrate in Nagarkoil in Tamil Nadu.
Okay. Okay.
By Judge Mr. G. Christian. So this case relates to a temple theft of gold ornaments, precious stones, and diamond crown on the Adikesava Perumal statue at Adikesava Perumal temple in Tiruvattar in Nagarkoil. So while there are 14 of them who received 6 years imprisonment, with others with 3 years of imprisonment. I would like to just briefly state what were all the sections under which the case was continued. So it comes under the IPC, Indian Penal Code, section 120B, punishment of criminal conspiracy. This 120B read with 409, criminal breach of trust by public servant. 411, dishonestly receiving stolen property. 114, abettor present when offence is committed. 414, assisting in concealment of stolen property. And 218, public servant framing incorrect record and writing in intent to save property from forfeiture.
Right.
Old shrine in Tiruvattar, and in the year 19, the judgment was given in the year 2019, September 19, 2019. So we find a similar case, even though we will not be able to tell whether it has been exactly replicated, but to a certain extent, this one is also a very interesting case where the temple priest, the workers in the temple, and other people who accompanied them were involved in theft, and also they stole around 6.5 kg of gold from the temple. To hide the theft, the temple priest and the workers who were involved in the crime gave the gold coating to tin sheets cut from oil containers and covered the stolen portion with these sheets. So I think they have planned it very well, but unfortunately, once the case was transferred to the CBCID investigation wing, the mystery unfolded, and fortunately 23 of the accused who were initially there were 34 persons who were involved in this, and as and when the case proceeded, 10 of them died owing to old age and few of them committed suicide. The remaining 23 accused were convicted. All the 13 of them received 6 years, 14 of them received 6 years of imprisonment and a fine of up to 3,70,000. So here there were imprisonment and also fine. So I am sure that this has got some resemblance with the case study which you have taken.
Pretty much, especially about reopening it after several decades and pronouncing a judgment. After all these years, that some of them have even passed away. Similarly, here the temple priest has passed away by the judgment before the judgment was pronounced. But the remaining people, all their properties were confiscated. One common thing that you see here, as far as the judgments in Chola period is concerned, even cases like murder or other things have been dealt with in today's context very mildly, but theft in temples, thieving temple properties, and all that have been dealt with very severely. So next case is another very interesting case. We'll also see another similar temple theft case after this one. But the second case is quite interesting. It's a fight over a piece of land in the boundary between two settlements. There is an equally old temple called in a place called Thiruverumbiyur, on the outskirts of Trichy, right on the banks of Kaveri River. And so it's another age-old temple on a small hillock. In fact, it's a protected monument, a very beautiful temple by the Cholas, early Cholas in fact, and sanctified by the hymns of the Nayanar saints once again. And this temple has enjoyed a lot of patronage from the early Chola kings. So it's another wealthy temple. The case is, there is another settlement just next to Thiruverumbiyur called as Shrikanta Chaturvedi Mangalam. So that should have been another settlement. And you have the Ur Sabai of Thiruverumbiyur, or the local administration of Thiruverumbiyur itself. So there are these two people. And right on the banks of Kaveri. Now we see similar cases fought even up till the 17th century between the settlements in Srirangam and Thiruvanekka, two extremely old and historic temple-based settlements on the other banks of Kaveri River, in fact. And the problem is, when I say on the banks, they are literally on the banks, just touching it. So every time Kaveri floods, water comes in and all these boundary stones that are erected are washed away. So there are several cases where the existing boundary stones were lost because of floods, and the people from both these settlements have fought. I mean, Thiruvanekka and Srirangam. And the kings had to intervene, or the local chieftain had to intervene. But in this case, it's a very interesting case where a common piece of land was for very long fought upon for rights and legal powers by both the settlements. Surprisingly, the local chieftain was appointed by the king to find a solution, because it's been dragging on for quite some time, and the people who are supposed to be the ones who are administering and governing and they put in charge of legal activities there themselves were fighting for it. So in this case, a local chieftain intervenes, and very interestingly, he calls both the groups who claim ownership over the land out of his pocket, settles them, pays them money which they claim for each of the property, buys the land, technically buys the land from both the properties, convinces them, buys it from both the properties, and not that he settles with it, but in turn, he hands it over to the temple, gives it over to the temple, and requests that the revenue from this patch of land, which was under, which was under this fight, the kind of arbitration that he did was under it, hands it over to the temple and says the revenue from the land can be used to remunerate the temple musicians and the singers who are employed at the temple. Seems like a very, very easy way to get over a boundary issue that has been going on for long. But you need someone as powerful as the local chieftain to intervene, pay both the parties, convince them, settle the issue in a very different way, and hand it over to the temple so that there are no future implications, there are no future legal implications on it from either side, makes it a temple property, and also brings it to a use. He assigns that particular piece of land to be used to pay the temple musicians. Quite an interesting way to handle boundary disputes. So what are your points on this?
Boundary dispute, even though I could not find any case law relating to this particular issue, I would like to say that when two persons quarrel, the third person gains. Here, the chieftain has used the opportunity to take away the land, the disputed land from both of them. But in fact, even though he has gained in one sense, but he has given it back to the society, at least the temple at large. Even though during those times, temples were considered as the important place of public congregation and one of the, the place where all the people enjoyed equal rights and equal participation. But as far as
there are again several inscriptions. Sorry to cut in here. There are several inscriptions which speaks about how members from various different society came forward to represent when it is a social congregation, and even in legal activities like this, people from different sections were they were approved to be a part of it, and their knowledge also has acted in solving issues. Please continue.
The closest reference which I can get, considering there are a considerable amount of Tamil audience, the closest reference of a property dispute which I am able to recollect is the cult classic Devar Magan, where there is a similar kind of a property dispute. But unfortunately, even though the case doesn't anyway has any connection with this particular case study which you have told, those are all the similar lines which I'm able to draw with. But in fact, this property or the boundary matter, when it comes to boundary, this is a never-ending what do you call contention for two parties. There are so many instances where two small villages have fought for a particular piece of land. Then a group of villages have fought with another group of villages. Then a city with another city. Then a country with another country. Now we are witnessing border dispute and border tensions with China, and also we are facing similar line of control issue with Pakistan. So even though we do not want any other country to come and interfere in our dispute, it is only between the two countries, India and Pakistan, or for that matter, India and China. But it would be great if some kind of moderation or a dispute resolution mechanism is brought into place for smooth settlement of this matters. Even though I don't see any this what do you call peaceful negotiation apparently, but some kind of an initiative has to be made from both the countries for getting a result out of this mediation or talks in high level mediations. That is what I feel.
Fair enough. Okay, so but to me personally, this particular inscription is of some importance because you know it's interesting to see how two settlements, one is Chaturvedi Mangalam and the other belongs to you know the other communities, and both of them have their connect with the local temple, which is very special, as I told you, and still there was a boundary dispute. And I mean, this does not seem to be like a standard thumb rule used by others, because that's why I picked up this inscription, because this is very, very exclusive and you know, very rare case where a chieftain does not mind. He goes on, he takes another step, extra step, and pays both the parties, gets them relieved of whatever control they assumed they had over the piece of land, and does not seem to enjoy it for his own benefits too, as you pointed out. Gives it over to the larger social benefit of handing it over to the temple, and also creating a way the revenue should be spent also, remunerating the temple musicians. So that's something interesting that I thought about this inscription. Let's move on to the third case here. Yeah, so that is about a woman, a third case, yeah. A woman who committed suicide. So this woman is brought in front of the local court, the Sabha. Apparently, she is she's said to have not been regular in her taxes. She's not paid her taxes, and so she's brought in front of the Sabha. And as an individual woman, apparently the inscription does not give us any data about her family. So a few scholars assume that she was a single parent, probably, or an individual. And so she is brought in, and she is put into a legal course, and there are a lot of questions on her, and she, unable to stand the shame of an ordeal to which she, according to her, she is not to be subjected. She says, I've paid my taxes and I've been regular. We're not sure about the kind of receipts that were given or otherwise. So, but she argues, telling that she has been regular in her taxes, but the accusation is that she's accused of not having paid her taxes regularly. But being put in front of the Sabha and being questioned and all that had caused a sense of shame in her. And this public shaming, I know she, after her questioning, after she being questioned for her taxes, according to her, which she is not liable, she commits suicide and she dies. Now, this is an interesting case where the cause of the suicide is none but the person who is sitting in the position of a judge. The person who is supposed to pronounce the judgment has knowingly or unknowingly become the cause for the loss of life of a woman again. So this, I mean, probably gains some light, and it is taken over to a more serious court, probably with the royal judiciary and inquiry there. So the inscription very clearly says it was a huge body that was constituted for the inquiry. It constituted members from 4 different quarters of that settlement, 18 different districts, and various states who have come in from the Chola country. This is an important case. So they have brought in all the learned council members from various parts of the Chola country, and they have come forward to discuss over it. Apparently, going by records, he seemed to produce the records. The convict himself, who is the one who owns the record room rights probably, or the access to the record rooms, he produces the receipts and says, no, she is not paid. And to prove her innocent, there is nothing in hand. But her death has been caused by this gentleman here. A very complicated case. So the people feel now that there is paucity of witness or records on her side to prove her not guilty, but here he has knowingly or unknowingly had caused the death of a woman. So he is penalized with a penalty. I mean, a penalty is imposed on him for 32 units of money. That's what is the pronounced judgment. 32 units of money. The inscription calls it as castle. Different scholars have different opinion about what is this denomination, whether it's gold coins of very small measurement or what exactly it is not known. The metal or what has gone into making those castles, we are not sure. So I'm just using the term units of money. Whatever it was, 32 units of money is the penalty imposed on him. That's the case and the judgment. Now to you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. So this is a very interesting case which you have touched upon. It involves a lot of questions in it, and even though the judgments at that time would have given directly by the royal court, but here how we deal here in this Indian judiciary currently is quite different. According to IPC section 354, assault or criminal force to a woman with an intent to outrage her modesty. So this outrage her modesty is a very broad term. It is also very, what do you call it? It is not properly defined. In fact, what constitutes an outrage to female modesty is not clear as on date. So any explicit usage of words or verbal abuse and verbally attacking the person and also physical assault, everything constitutes the outrage of modesty of a woman. So here the section deals with whoever assaults or uses criminal force to any woman intending to outrage or knowing it to be likely that he will thereby outrage her modesty shall be punished with imprisonment of either description for a term which shall not be less than 1 year, but which may extend to 5 years and shall also be liable to fine. So classification of offense also comes in, is also a matter here. So the punishment, imprisonment for 1 year, which may extend up to 5 years and with a fine, is cognizable and non-bailable, and it is trialable by any magistrate. So this is very important here. Our judicial system is giving utmost priority when it comes to protecting the modesty of a woman. So even though there are a lot of cases where the outrage of this is available as case laws, I would like to just quote one exception where the modesty of women was the West Bengal, the High Court of Kolkata, it informed that there is no intent to outrage the modesty of a woman. That is Ramdas was a state of West Bengal, this AAR 1954 SC 711, where just by use of any abusive words or any passing remark does not constitute abuse of outraging the modesty of a woman. So I would like to quote this exception here. We may be able to find lot of case laws pertaining to this section 354, but this exception I would like to inform the participants so that what constitutes outrage of the modesty of women and what doesn't will be clarified here. There are a lot of examples. At the same time, each state has got its own amendments. Like state of Andhra Pradesh has got section 354 substitute the following, where assault or criminal force to a woman with an intent to outrage her modesty shall be punished with an imprisonment of either description for a term which shall not be less than 5 years. Even though the IPC recommends 1 year up to 5 years, the state of Andhra Pradesh has its own amendment where it says if there is any case of outrage against modesty of a woman, the punishment shall not be less than 5 years. Similarly, there are separate amendments in Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, and Orissa. So, while reading all these, what we can safely conclude is two things. One, what constitutes an outrage to female modesty is not very clearly defined, even though there is a recent Supreme Court judgment where modesty has been defined as the essence of a woman's modesty is her sex. The culpable intention of the accused is the crux of the matter. So the intention of the accused is also the crux of the matter. So considering all this, the case study which you have told relates to section 354 of the present laws. That is
Right.
what I am able to draw a line here, draw the parallel here. Even though the judgment would differ drastically depending upon the times of the imperial cholas to the present time, but the similar section which is in the contemporary laws is section 354 of IPC.
That's interesting. But what makes this particular case interesting is, the person who is accused for having, forced her into attempt something like a suicide and to lose her life is the person who can be put at par with the judges probably. The person who is put in charge to pronounce the judgment, knowingly or unknowingly, has caused the death of her. And you can see the magnitude of importance this case has gained for having received such wide attention from learned council members from various states, districts being brought in, because the accused himself is the judge there, someone who can be put at par with the judge there, and they have inquired this and they were convinced that he cannot be pronounced something as severe as death penalty because he has not wantedly done this. His duty was to ensure that the taxes are paid, but the woman had considered it to be a shame on herself and she is committed suicide. That's how they have handled it. Now to the fourth case, yet another interesting case where the convict is a 6-year-old boy, a kid probably. And this is from the period of Kulothunga, the early years of Kulothunga the first, the early part of 12th, 13th century. So a boy of 6 years old, he is playing with a sickle, apparently without parental guidance. Let's assume that his father has left that weapon there, and for some domestic use, probably he was using it for wood cutting or otherwise. So a sickle was lying there. This little kid was playing with the kid from the neighboring house who was 7 years of age. The sickle has caused an injury which led to the death of the neighboring house kid. So the 6-year-old was playing with it and another boy was there nearby somewhere, and it has inflicted injury and the 7-year-old has died. So this is the case. This is brought in front of the local sabha, and it's quite interesting to note that there was no intention to harm or which led to kill the other kid, and the offender is 6 years of age. Probably he didn't even know things like killing someone or going to that extent, and the child hasn't got any track records of having been notorious that way or causing harm to others. But considering all that on one side, the other side of the balance is the loss of life of a 7-year-old kid who is also equally dear to his parents, and probably a child who has lost his life that early. So all that is there. A death which had no intention, and the convict is a 6-year-old. How is this handled in today's case? I'll come to the judgment given probably after you finish your views on this. So how would this be attempted?
Thank you, Professor. I would like to know whether those two were siblings or they were neighbors, the kids.
Neighbors. They're not siblings.
Okay. So this comes under this 6-year-old kid will be considered as a juvenile here as per the Juvenile Justice Act, and also in certain union territories they have got children's court and before awarding a sentence, and whether they will be able to transfer the case for a normal trial in the normal court. So most of the children court are restricted to certain parts of the union territories. So as far as the larger picture is concerned, this comes under the Juvenile Justice Act, where the child or the accused, if we may say, comes under the Juvenile Justice Act since he is a 6-year-old kid. Interestingly, I am finding an article here which has also got a similar type of incidents, but even though there was we can presume that there was no intention in the case which you have taken, but here the case study is slightly different. I find a judgment here in Muhammad Huzafia Javed Ahmed versus the state of Maharashtra, judgment given by Justice D.S. Naidu in the Bombay High Court on July 15, 2019. This is we can call it as a 17-year-old boy to be tried as juvenile in the murder of a toddler. So a brief explanation about the case is 2 juveniles who allegedly kidnapped and brutally murdered a 3-year-old child in Nagpada in 2016. The juvenile court decided that the older boy, who is of 17 years old, and the younger one is 16 years old, they were siblings, and they murdered a 3-year-old neighbor's child. So the Juvenile Justice Board had ordered that the 17-year-old boy to be tried as an adult for his role in killing the child, while the younger to be tried as a juvenile itself, since his role was specific to making the ransom calls. In fact, going inside the particular case, the 2 boys, one is of 16 years old and the other is 17 years, kidnapped a 3.5-year-old baby and strangled her with a mobile charger cord on December 5th and made ransom calls to the family 19 days later to avoid suspicion. All this while the child's body lay on the terrace an arm's length from the house on the Duncan Road in the particular town. So the juvenile board decided that the older boy to be tried in the normal course of court proceedings. Then in fact, the older boy had been in remand home ever since his arrest in 2016. Immediately after the incident happened in 2016, the boy was arrested and then he was in remand. Whether he should be tried as an adult under the CRPC was the ultimate question that was in front of the justice in the Bombay High Court. But according to the judgment, it was argued that the older boy, who is of 17 years old, should also be tried in the juvenile, according to the Juvenile Justice Act. Even though there was intention, but since he was underage to be considered as a normal person, he was also tried in the Juvenile Justice Act, according to Juvenile Justice Act. In fact, this is a very what do you call is a landmark judgment given in the Bombay High Court. If the participants are interested, I would like to give the case law as well. This is Muhammad Huzafia Javed Ahmed versus the state of Maharashtra in the Bombay High Court. One more interesting point which I am able to recollect here is, Professor, there was a movie which was released in Malayalam. The name of the movie is Ente Veedu Appu Vendayum. That is, my home is also Appu's home. It was released in 2003 and it was later remade in Tamil also. It was directed by C.B. Malayali. I will just read the, of course, this is based on the true incident. I am not able to trace the true incident, but I would just like to highlight to our audience the general plot, which is quite similar to what we have discussed here. It revolves around parents and a little child who are a very happy family. In fact, the mother is a stepmother, but treats the stepson with equal love and affection, and they are very close to each other. And in fact, the stepmother gives birth to a son, and it is the stepson who is very, very happy to know about the birth of a younger brother. In fact, he names him Appu and cares much for him. So after the baby is born, the parents start paying attention more to the baby. In fact, the boy, who is known by name Vasu, feels left out. In fact, uh, he thinks his parents are giving more preference to the baby, and due to insecurity, when he sees when his parents are not there, he unintentionally kills the baby. And after when their parents come to know about this, immediately the trial starts, and then after the trial, the boy is getting imprisonment according to the Juvenile Justice Act in a juvenile home. It is a reformatory home. And then after completing the term there, the boy goes back to his family, and to his surprise, he finds another younger brother to welcome him there. In fact, in most of the cases, the courts are of the opinion that this act is more of reformative and not retributive. So this act is mostly for reformation purpose. It is giving an opportunity for the juvenile to reform and then come back to the normal society as a normal human being, even though the death would have been intentional or unintentional. In fact, another parallel I would like to draw is section 299, where it is considered as culpable homicide not amounting to death, not amounting to murder, even though the death has happened, but there was no intention of causing a death to that particular person. So section 299 is one more example which I would like to tell. This movie I would like to quote, but of course I am not able to trace the exact case on which this movie is based upon. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there is a judgment in Mumbai High Court which I have already quoted. So these are all the instances where I am able to draw a parallel with the case study which you have mentioned here. And I would like to hear from you, Professor. I am very eager to know about that.
It was very simple. The boy's father was asked to create an endowment in the local temple to burn half a perpetual lamp. Simple. So, I mean, see, the way we should understand the concept of creating such endowments is, it's because it's a local court. People probably knew both the families, and the case of both the kids, the people who sat as judges know about both the kids. There was absolutely no intention at all to inflict an injury or to cause an injury, and which resulted to death by the little kid. But again, like in the case of the woman, the previous case where she committed suicide, it's a death. End of the day, it's a death of a little kid who was also innocent. The offender's innocence is well proven, but there is a loss of life. Best way to handle this is, this was probably, instead of considering this as a crime, I personally feel they've considered this more as a sin. And in order to help the little kid to purify itself from a sin which it caused, because sins are caused at any age, directly or indirectly. Even if you are a part of, if you're indirectly a part of a sin that is committed, it is still on you. So in order to help the kid not take upon itself something like this, an endowment to donate 16 cows probably to the local temple to burn half a perpetual lamp was given as the remedy for the father. Absolutely. I mean, this in today's context, I'm downright sure most of people here or the audience or anybody, common man, cannot accept this as a well-served judgment. But the perspectives with which they have looked at it 1,000 years back is totally different. They only thought we should help the little kid from not falling into the pit of sin. Yeah. So the fifth case for the day. This is also.
I would just like to tell one thing. Yeah. In fact, there is no concept of sin here in the contemporary laws. But even though there was a process of purification, here there is a process of reformation. The judiciary is giving an opportunity for the juvenile or the child to reform himself, mend his ways, and be a normal citizen when he comes back from the prison or the reformatory school where he has been given the boarding. So though
when I started telling that there were concepts of prison by itself was only for extremely severe crimes, like assassinating a king or something like that. Even the presence of such schools for reformation, other things are beyond the scope in those days. So No, their perspective was that it's a sin. I mean, it's not a crime as such because there was no intention, but the kid would have earned some sin, which the local public thought that they had the responsibility of helping the kid from coming out of it, and that's how they have pronounced the penalty for it.
Professor, what do you think? Is it the moral responsibility of the parent, the child's father, to take upon the moral responsibility upon himself, or it is a negligence on the part of the father? Which one do you think is more apt in this context?
I mean, again, calling it negligence might sound very apt again in today's context, but leaving the sickle within the reach of a little kid at whatever level, yes, it's negligence in that time also, for sure. That there's no doubt in that. The parents' negligence is there, but the court then doesn't seem to have counted it. They've not taken it into account at all.
The moral responsibility aspect, moral responsibility, whether the father
probably that is why the punishment or the penalty to be paid is on the father. The 6-year-old kid is definitely not going to pursue earning money and endowing whatever has been asked to create the endowment. So that is directly on the father, of course.
So the judgment was given based on the facts, and it was awarded to the father, in fact.
Of course, yes. The little kid's father has been asked to create the endowment. That's how the inscription goes.
Yes. Quite interesting. One of,
a very unique case, in fact.
Yeah.
So the fifth case for today is misappropriation of temple property. But what makes it different from the first case that we saw was theft, and this is misappropriation. This is from the early quarters of the 13th century, the times of Rajaraja III. This is from a temple called Tirunakeshwaram, outskirts of Kumbakonam, a very, very popular temple, which received a lot of patronage and attention from the imperial Cholas. In fact, it was a temple which was particularly favorite for a few kings. So that has been endowed with a lot of property. 2 brothers and another third person were employed as accountants of the temple, and they had access to the temple treasury and had to maintain the accounts and other things. And to the surprise of other employees in the temple, which included the priests, they've discovered that these 2 brothers, and the 2 brothers especially, they have acquired temple properties, misappropriated temple properties, transferred the rights to their names, stolen silk garments that were endowed to ornament the deities there. More interestingly, used temple bricks to build structures in their property, their own property. Again, that's misappropriation of the temple wealth. So a complaint is lodged because it's associated with a temple, and a temple which is very exclusively, a favorite temple for the kings. It is taken over with the royal high official, a person called Pillai Yadavaraya. So it's on him now to investigate. Fortunately for the temple people and unfortunately for the convicts, Rajaraja III, the king himself, was camping in a place very near Tirunakeshwaram, and through the proximity factor, it is directly taken to the notice of the king. And so he comes to know about it and orders an inquiry which involved checking of the accounts thoroughly. And this checking, apparently, quite interestingly, involves accounting for the bricks that were bought from the kilns to be used in the temple, and they have checked whether it is used to construct or renovate any part of the temple, which to their surprise, nothing had been used. But there were new constructions that had happened in the property belonging to these individuals who were accountants. So it is directly proved that they are guilty and misappropriation of their power and temple wealth, as an extension, the temple wealth. So they were tried for this, and they were punished by confiscation of land which belonged to both the brothers and as an extension to any other member in the family. It was all brought out for public auction, sold for 40,000 units of money, which was later deposited in the temple treasury. And the post of being the temple accountants, of course, they were chucked out of their professional services rendered in the temple. And the post itself was sold, was again auctioned, and people with some required qualifications can participate in the auction. And an individual who was capable enough to buy it in auction bought it for 3,000 units of money. So it was settled that way. See, the concept of confiscating property and auctioning it in public. We'll be discussing it with the last case, the next case. That seemed to have happened only for very severe crimes, which included the temple property rights here. And if you can recall the first case from Trikkalkundram, where I told the temple priest, the security guard, and two other people managed to break the seal and walk into the coffers to steal money and set the seal back again in place and escape. There, confiscation did not stop with the people who were involved in the crime alone. On the other hand, all their immediate blood relatives, their brother's son, that's like 2 generations together, all their properties were confiscated, publicly auctioned, and the money made there, revenue made there through the auction was deposited in the temple coffers. So here, at least it's only with him and his immediate blood relatives again. Confiscation of property, auctioning it, and making that as a revenue to the temple coffers, and throwing them out of the job. Now with absolutely no property in hands, but for having enjoyed all the social privileges a little before, and now being thrown out in the streets with no rights whatsoever. And in some cases, they are ousted from the village or the community, so they cannot buy any property for themselves, even if they want to restart their living. So that pushes them down to an extremely unbearable psychological pain also. Apart from just being socially pushed out and all that, there is also a very, very strong psychological issues also. So that's the case, the 5th case. Now over to you.
Thank you, Professor.
Anandji, if I am audible, shall I continue with the 6th case? So once you're back, we'll take your comments. Okay, great. So people can hear me by the time he sets it back. I'll just present the 6th case. This is another extremely interesting case because it's in fact one of the mysteries that are still unresolved as far as Chola history is concerned. So we have this king here, the person from the elder brother of Rajaraja the Great, who was assassinated. A very, very popular plot for people who are familiar with Ponniyin Selvan, one of the classics of Tamil literature in the last century. In fact, the complete plot revolves around this mysterious murder of the Hare King, the blood brother of elder brother of Rajaraja the Great. So we're still not sure as to how he was assassinated. In fact, the very point that the king was murdered is got from the inscriptions where Rajaraja pronounces the judgment for the convicts. So it's one of the greatest mysteries of imperial Chola period, or as an extension of Indian history of all these monarchs, one of the most popular mysteries as to how he was assassinated. And this happened during the peak period of the imperial Cholas. The king Aditya Chola was almost what Rajendra is to the southern part, what Rajaraja is to the southern parts. He was monitoring the Chola boundary in the northern parts of today's Tamil Nadu. He was put in charge and he was ruling from Kanchipuram. Even all this we come to know through a lot of inscriptions of his available in places like Kanchipuram, Tirupati areas. So we assume that he was there, and there are also a few lines in these inscriptions which speaks him to be put in charge of the northern parts of Tamil Nadu. So he is assassinated. The place and all that is also still unclear. We are not exactly sure as to where he was assassinated, but the very point that availability of his inscriptions. Yeah, it's perfect now, Ji.
Yeah, sir, I think there was some error in my line.
Okay.
So can I just continue, or would you like to
please. I've just started the 6th case. So shall I finish that off and then come to you? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure, Professor. I will cover both the cases.
Right. So the 6th case is the assassination of the elder brother of Rajaraja, Aditya Karikalan, a very popular one, a king whose assassination is still unresolved. So this particular king, his inscriptions, the availability of his inscriptions is concentrated mostly in the northern parts of Tamil Nadu, today's Tamil Nadu. And his inscriptions suddenly disappear. There are no inscriptions after a point of time. And we are very sure he was not coronated. He never went on to become the coronated king. And there is also this plot about how Rajaraja's cousin becomes the king for an intermediate period, or a brief period in between. And then the throne is transferred, the crown is transferred to Rajaraja. So that way, this elder brother, the biological elder brother of Rajaraja, has never gotten a chance to be coronated. That is a gray area. And what happened to him exactly is got from an inscription in a temple again, a very small temple in fact, while the Cholas had patronized huge temples in many parts of Tamil Nadu and have built their own temples like the big temple in Tanjavur and other things. This particular judgment for the assassination or an inscription where an indirect reference to the assassination is given is from a very, very small temple, small by size and other things, in a place called Udayarkudi in the outskirts of Chidambaram town, in a Shiva temple there, wherein a direct reference to, again, identifying these people who were a part of the plot for assassination, and the punishment given to them was again confiscation of property of all their blood relatives. Now that includes not just the brothers of the convict, but their in-laws, their brothers-in-laws, people who have given their daughter in marriage to a guy in the convict's family, their uncles, aunts, even up to the little kid, all of them, the property was confiscated and they were ousted, what is called as Desa Prashtam, or pushing them out of the country, taking them all the way up to the geographical boundary of a country and throwing them on the other side, and making life extremely miserable for them has been attempted on them. Now, concept of ousting a person on lines of community, ousting him outside the community or pushing him outside the country as such, Jati Prashtam or Desa Prashtam, is something that finds references from Smritis and also Ardhashastra and several places. The reasons which they find fit to cause such a severe judgment and all that, it finds references in text which speaks about rules and regulations to be followed for a dynamic and a more balanced rule by a king. So that's there, and this is one of its case where all people involved with them, even families that have gotten to them through wedlocks or marital alliances, even they have been punished, the land confiscated, and they were sent out of the country. Once again, the reasons for the assassination, or exactly who did it and where it happened, the details about the assassination plot and all that is not yet clear. But the inscription speaks about how the properties were confiscated, all of theirs, and it was brought out in public auction. And the person who bought it is also from another temple town nearby. So he buys it, a Kshatriya in fact, he buys it and sells it and deposits that money again for the temple expenses in this particular village. The reason as to why this temple was chosen for the deposit like this and the inscription being engraved there and all that is still a mystery for us. This is a very, very severe issue of assassination of the person who was going to be crowned as the king of the mighty Chola Empire in their peak period. Over to you, Advocate Anandji.
So taking the lead from the fifth question, the fifth case law which we just discussed here, as far as our properties of temples are concerned, whenever there is any authority, power or privilege given to a particular person without any accountability, or even in fact there is an accountability, the chances of embezzlement of funds, misappropriation of funds have been large, and there are n number of cases in the history of modern independent India where we can show such and such person has misappropriated the funds of such and such temple like that. We can go on so on and so forth for n number of temples and n number of other places of importance, public importance, a charitable trust or something like that. One interesting case which I would like to tell you all, which I recently came across, even though the case is under trial still, but I would like to tell you a similar case where a Sai Baba temple trustees booked for missing cash and ornaments. It was in Nagpur. The police have filed an FIR and registered an offence of criminal breach of trust against 7 trustees of Barda Road based Sai Mandir temple for embezzling funds and ornaments and misappropriation of funds donated by the devotees. The complainant has claimed that valuables including 30,000 rupees donated as cash and ornaments worth rupees 21.30 lakhs have been misappropriated by the accused. Around 500 grams of gold and 22 kilograms of silver ornaments belonging to temple have also been misappropriated. An FIR has been filed and the matter has been taken up by the court. So we cannot comment more on that particular case, but I would like to draw reference to the case which you mentioned earlier with regard to misappropriation of funds by the temple authorities or the custodian of the temple properties. There are n number of cases which are still under trial. Are those people, whether they are really culprits or not, is also a question, different question, and that can be left for a different discussion. Now, coming back to the next question, $1 million next case study, the $1 million question of who killed the heir apparent or the Yuvaraja. Just for the lighter moment, who killed Bahubali? We can similarly draw lines on this. Who killed the Yuvaraja Aditya Chola? So here, instead of discussing about the contemporary laws, I would like to go back to 3067 BCE, as dated by Dr. D.K. Hari and Mrs. Hema Hari of Bharat Gyan, where 3067 BCE was recorded as the date of Kurukshetra war. So before that, before the Kurukshetra war, there were attempts by the Kauravas to kill the Pandavas. Pandavas and Yudhishthira, who was the heir apparent, the Yuvaraja of the entire Hastinapur, was they were trying to dethrone him, and they were trying to assassinate the entire Pandava, the 5 brothers, along with their mother, once in the Wax Palace, and then even before that, Bhimsen was tried to be they tried to kill Bhimsen by giving him poison. So I find there are similarities in those cases when there is a heir apparent who is going to take up the throne next in line, and when there are people who are against him or who are against that person to ascend the throne, there are always internal feuds and internal royal fights that have happened. But this one is a classic example. This has been recorded in our scriptures and one of the earliest written documents available for us to study or take reference to. Instead of going to the contemporary laws, I just went one step ahead. In fact, I went backwards and tried to correlate that particular case which you told regarding Aditya Chola with the Mahabharata, similarly to the Yudhishthira, the Crown Prince Yudhishthira. If this is convincing for you, I would like to get an opinion on this, Professor.
Sure. Before that, there is a question about who are the people who were excommunicated. The inscription refers to 3 people. All 3 are referred to as brothers. The first gentleman, his name is, the culprit is Soman. Second is Ravidasan, who was apparently a Brahmadiraja. And the third is Parameshwaran, who was also a Brahmadiraja. So going by the fact that they are Brahmadirajas, we can be assured that they were also part of the royal, they were employees under the king quite closely, because Brahmadirajan is a title given to people who were of administrative significance and all that. So these 3 people, but the property of Ravidasa Gramavittan, the brother of one of these convicts, is also finds a mention in the inscription. So we can be sure that people biologically related with all of them, and people who have in fact went on for marital alliance with their families, have all of them have been convicted, and the property is confiscated, sold, and they were also excommunicated from the outset, from the country itself. And now to answer your question, this is a very, very unique case because in the whole of Chola history, this is the only assassination plot with a conspiracy behind it. And as I told you in the beginning, this is one of the cases that are yet to be resolved. In fact, the very opinion of popular epigraphists and historians on this particular inscription, which is the only proof to say that there was an assassination, by itself differs. By and large, they all accept that there was a plot, a conspiracy in fact, and these are the 3 people who were convicts. And the property has been, it was confiscated and sold out and deposited in the temple. So at that level, they all accept it. But so here, coming back to answer your question, a very, very unique case. And the importance that was given to cases like this, where there was an assassination of a king himself, seems to be there for the first time here in Aditya Choda's case?
Yes, Professor. But one thing I can't help from. Is it audible, Professor?
Yeah, you are. Please.
Yeah. No, one thing I cannot just draw a parallel here is sorry to again and again come to the South Indian cinemas. One thing which you have told here has been taken up in the film called Citizen, where the relatives of the accused, in fact, the convicts, the hero argues that the relations, those who have given
marital alliances also, yeah.
Their alliances, they were all to be taken up for trial. In fact, they all had to be their properties need to be confiscated, and they had to their passports also need to be impounded. So
that's similar to being excommunicated, right? I mean, confiscating someone's passport and leaving them like citizens of no land.
Yes, Professor. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so these are the 6 cases that I thought I should present. A couple of observations that I made when I did the study for judgments exclusively for the presentation. One is, if a temple has 10 inscriptions, the possibility of having inscriptions that speaks about cases and other things are like probably 1 or 1.5. That's the percentage I can go into when it comes to a set of 10 inscriptions probably. And mostly these cases are partly civil, partly criminal, and in some cases there is also a combination. And the judgments pronounced aren't one string that they have held tight or one code book that they have followed throughout. It varies according to case. The appropriateness or the authority of witnesses and all that also differs. And it might not be exactly right to compare and contrast with the scenario today, because these judgments are part of the society that existed the way it functioned a good 1,000 years back. Yeah, so a few friends of mine asked, in fact, whether it is right to have a title like this where we compare judgments pronounced for cases which are 1,000 years apart. But I had to clarify it here. The intention was not to show that there is a wide range of difference. The difference is very well understood, but the perspective of people who are in the position of a judge to understand it and look at it and their perspective again. So that seems to differ by and large. And as you pointed out, the concept of sin or preventing it or giving ways to come out of the sin and other things is not it is not brought for consideration at all, the way today's laws are framed. But we are talking about those days where we have enough episodes in Puranas which speaks about how even the celestial beings like Indra and all of them, when they have sinned and they were cursed, the best way for them to cleanse themselves of the sin is to light lamps and conduct worships or to build temples and other things. And I think these are what they have brought it out. These are what have had its impact on pronouncing these judgments. Thank you, Gino. Over to you.
Yeah. Yes, Professor. In fact, we started this event just for comparing and contrasting the cases. What was the treatment given at that time for theft? What would have been what is the treatment now? What was the treatment that was given for a juvenile when he committed a crime? What is that? Is the judgment or the laws that gives the orders for a person who is committing a crime now? So there is no relationship between the laws or the legal procedures that were adopted in some 1,500 years ago to those that are present in the current situation. This is just to draw parallels and just to find out whether there are similar kind of incidences and how that has been treated. In fact, even though people have changed, people have evolved, this civilization has evolved, but the crimes have remained the same. In fact, even though the white collar crimes and other crimes have evolved over a period of time now, but by and large, the crimes or the matters that have come to the court judiciary or that matter the royal king's courts have remained the same. Even at that time, there were thefts. Even at that time, there were charges of misappropriation of funds. Even now, we find the same kind of cases that we are dealing day in and day out in our Indian judicial system.
I think that this one was what we planned, Professor, and I think we were able to give a decent insight on how the things were there at that time and how the things are here in this time. Of course, you have given a wonderful presentation. I have tried my level. I have tried a bit from my part. I thank you, Professor, for this wonderful presentation. And I would just, for the want of time, I would just quickly like to move to the next segment before I give you a chance to conclude your part, Professor.
Sure.
Yeah. So this one we will take it up as rapid fire round if you are okay.
Okay.
Here now,
fine, go ahead.
Yeah. In the present context, we have the system called emergency hearing, where for a particular case, we will file a petition for hearing it on an emergency basis. Do you find any references in the older Imperial Chola period or in the previous history where we are able to trace some kind of emergency hearings in courtrooms or for that matter the Gram Sabhas?
To the best of my knowledge, there doesn't seem to be any direct reference to something like the emergency cases wherein there is actually a serious necessity to intervene right there for the judges to file before something more severe happens, to stop something from happening and all that. We've seen several cases like that. Where the case demands an immediate intervention, but doesn't really seem to the best of my knowledge again, doesn't seem to have any direct references to something as immediate as this, to stop something. If there was something happening which demands an immediate intervention, such things should have been taken immediately to the notice of the king himself. Yeah, whatever the matter is, the serious concern is, would be taken up there directly. But pronouncing judgments on a case like this or calling for the court to be available the very next day or a couple of hours from filing a case and all that doesn't seem to have happened.
Okay, Professor, thank you for the clarification. So in this sense, I think the contemporary laws gives you right to immediately go for an emergency hearing. That is what I feel. So moving on to the next question. Yes, Professor.
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
So moving on to the next question. You were talking about the reference of Sundaramurthy Nayanar case.
Yes.
Where you told the grandfather's manuscripts or grandfather's signatures were verified by the local Gram Sabha courts.
Yes.
So can we assume there were far more literate people, educated people during those times compared to now, considering the way the signatures were preserved and the documents were preserved, or for that matter, record rooms were created for preserving these kind of documents?
Okay, I cannot give you an exact answer as to whether the literacy was more or not, because the concept of demographics and other things aren't available for us for a direct reference. We talk about population and all that in a very, very indirect way. By applying mathematical logics and assumptions is how we have come to conclusions on population and other things. So about the rate of literacy, I cannot really talk about it. But the concept of knowing to at least read and write and other things have been existing for several centuries, even before the times of Sundaramurthy Nayanar himself. That is around 8th century, a little before 8th century. Because we see, take for example, the first available records on writing is the Sangam literature. We have people from various walks of life who have contributed to the compositions. You've got doctors, you've got warriors, you've got kings, you've got priests, you've got other random poets, and all of them from various walks of life and different sections of the society who have constituted. Topic of discussion seems to be very wide too, so it is not restricted to a particular community or a scenario as such. And there are wide ranges of topics that they have chosen to sing songs on or compose poetry upon. So and of course, archaeologically speaking, very recent discoveries in Kiridi or equally ancient discoveries in various other excavations that have happened in Tamil Nadu in the last 5-6 decades. The potsherds having graffiti written on them where the names are found, or the Tamil Brahmi inscriptions which is dated to 2nd or 3rd century BC and all that. So putting all that together, it seems like the popular theory that literacy was reserved for a few doesn't seem to stand hold. It has been widespread and they have known. In the case of Sundaramurthy Nayanar, which is more specific, the community to which he belongs to is that of the priest class, the Adishaivas, or the ordained priests to perform rituals in temples. So it's very obvious that his grandfather's signature or his a written copy of a manuscript that he's authored is available in the court in the record room is quite obvious.
Yes, Professor. Thank you for the clarification. Now moving on to the next question. We have a hierarchy in judicial system. First comes the Supreme Court of India, which is the apex court. Then we have the high courts in various states, Madras High Court, Delhi High Court, Bombay High Court, like that. We have high courts. Under that, we have district courts and subordinate courts. We even have quasi-judicial authorities who perform activities similar to that of courtroom. Even they have got certain rights and privileges for trial and for awarding the punishments and recovery of funds. Do you find any hierarchy or any type of courtrooms or courts for that matter in Imperial Chola period?
Of course, yes. As I told you, these two settlements based on demographics had their own village assemblies that served as courtrooms. Of course, for more significant events like political issues and other things, there should have existed royal courts which were governed probably by close associates of the king himself, but the records of which we are not having in hand. The epigraphs served as more as documents, primary documents of issues that were more close to the local society, but issues which involved the country's matters as such or of national importance as we call it today doesn't seem to have find records in the temple epigraphs. So but an existence of a court like that cannot be denied. It should have existed for a well laid out political and system like that the Cholas had, and cases like the temple property misappropriation that I told you as the fifth case today, wherein the king himself directly intervened because of his proximity to the place of crime, the temple where the theft happened, he has forced himself to be a part, and he has ordered inquiry into it and pronounced a judgment. So these cases show that the king had his own hand. If needed, or if there was a chance to get involved, he has gotten involved himself directly. But a clear-cut hierarchy of different courts that was available for people or that could be approached to people, we don't have enough data about it.
We can compare the king's judgment as the ultimate judgment, and we can compare it as the present Supreme Court.
Certainly.
Am I right?
Yes. Yeah. Certainly.
Yes. And just like how we maintain the records of the judgments, and which we take it as precedent for other judgments.
Yes.
Do you find that were there any inscriptions which are available to consider that all the documented judgments were documented? Say, for example, you were mentioning about the villages, Gram Sabhas. I presume that multiple Gram Sabhas will be there in a particular king's territory.
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
See, there was a proper geographical hierarchy. The Chola Empire were split into several states. Each state had its own uru, and each uru will be made up of more smaller controls systems, administrative systems, and all that. So each of it had its own performing legal body like this, or administrative body, whose scope was also to take up legal discussions.
Just wanted to ask you, but I think you have covered it in your speech, but anyway, I would like to ask it for the clarity purpose. Were there any possibility of going for an appeal, which we go now?
No, I just told you about it as a characteristic of the system. Availability of advocates or using them or employing them to fight for you, to defend you, or going for an appeal after a judgment is pronounced doesn't seem to have had any relevance at all. There doesn't seem to be any case that way. The only case of that woman committing suicide, because the convict himself was someone like the judge, so a special court was formed by more learned people from other districts and other states who came in to sit and argue and pronounce a judgment. But going for an appeal by a civilian doesn't seem to have happened.
No, irrespective of whether they were advocates or not, whether the person who was aggrieved himself was eligible to go for an appeal or for better...
No, there doesn't seem to be any record about an appeal, going for an appeal, or saying that I'm not satisfied with the judgment here, so I'm going to a more more powerful or the next higher authority of the legal panel available. No, that doesn't seem to have happened.
Okay, Professor. So I think, can we assume that here we have got a more realistic chance of going for an appeal, so that even if we are deprived of justice in a trial court or a lower court, we may find justice in the higher courts or the apex court for that matter?
Yes.
Yes. Now, moving on to the next question, Professor. Based on whatever information you have provided, I am of the opinion that during the time of election of a particular Gram Sabha member, there were no probably reported nepotism. There was a particular cooling period.
One of the prerequisites is if you as an individual have contested once and have been a part of the election, I mean, have won over the election and have managed to be a part of the Gram Sabha, your blood relatives, which included your own brothers and his sons and others, cannot contest for a specific period of time or specific terms which succeeded.
Yes, the
That's
cooling
there.
off
So,
period.
promoting, the cooling off period was there, very clearly marked. So, nepotism to say was completely curbed off through the available inscriptions in Uttarameru.
Yes. So there were no reported nepotism. There was a certain cooling off period. Then
yes,
one more prerequisite was he should have maintained an exemplary track record in his own profession, and there should not have been any,
and all that.
Yes, there should not be any criminal record against him.
No. Yes. There shouldn't be any.
He should have been well versed in his
the scriptures, the lineage of which he belongs to. Yes, that is there.
So based on the inputs which you have given, can we say the Chola period had far more organized framework when it comes to electing a particular person for a post than what we have now? Your quick thoughts on that.
I mean, for their own times, from the available records, we can tell that they were well organized. Again, comparing it with today's case, where the population is huge, the different the scope that you have to commit crimes and the different avenues to choose if you want to commit crimes, taking shortcuts, available options to take shortcuts or being illegal and all that was not even existing then. It was a very, very simple lifestyle people were leading, which probably didn't force them to involve in criminal activities. That's exactly why the crime rate seemed to have been less. Or existence of concepts like police stations. Now, one part you had the judgment and the courts that existed, but what happens to the police? That doesn't seem to have existed. You just had officers who inquired, and if there was a need, they were put in prisons and they were arrested. The concept of having handcuffs, arresting people, putting them behind bars, and all that has been there, but not in a very major scale as we see it today. Today, almost every neighborhood has a police station with a couple of cells. Yeah, if you're a convict and need to be prevented from being a part of society, you need to be isolated for safety reasons. Things every neighborhood has it. That doesn't seem to have been there in those days. So to their level, to their times, 1,000 to 800 years back, yes, they seem to have been exemplarily well organized, and probably the reasons why they could control and run a scenario like this, where the nation kind of was, was beyond even nautical borders.
Yes, Professor. They were less in population, and the crime rate also, I think, would have been less. So there was no need or necessity wouldn't have arose for the police, especially for the formation of police department as a whole. That is my take. But in fact, I would just like to reiterate what Mahatma Gandhi told once about the Panchayat Raj. It is the foundation of India's political system. It would have been a decentralized form of government where each village would be responsible for its own affairs. The terms for such a vision was the Gram Swaraj. So this Gram Swaraj, I think that was prevalent in those times, I think. And that was one of the most fundamental and powerful organization from where people got justice, or in fact they were self-sufficient and they did not require any other form of appeals there. The matter ended there, then and there, I think.
Yes.
Yes, Professor. There are only, I'll just take two questions.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. A few I thought I should answer.
Yes,
so I'll take the privilege of answering a few of them. Sure. One is about books that a few of them have asked. I would always prescribe when you want to learn about the Cholas, the most appropriate way, please stick on to the works of Sri K. Nilakanta Shastrigal, titled The Cholas, available in 2 parts, covers a wide range of topics that are to be understood when it comes to the Cholas, wherein he's given a small part on the legal, the existence of a legal system there, and the cases. All these 6 cases I've picked up from there, but he's given them as references as just 1 point or a line or 2, and he's given a beautiful bibliography which is also available. The cross references can be done from the records that he had suggested. He's quoted annual reports on epigraphy, volume numbers, and South Indian inscription volume numbers and other things, of which I have chosen cases that are unique and distinct. That's one thing. Second thing, there is a question about perjury. Yes, perjury was taken as a serious offense. So the credentials of a person who stood witness was always understood, and only then his witness was valued as such. And there is also a question on police stations and criminals. Doesn't seem to have existed any direct reference to police stations through inscriptions or the way criminals were treated when it comes to police station. One piece of information that can be understood from Chaljuka's travelogue, a Chinese traveler who came here around the 13th century, who's traveled across India and has documented several aspects. Of course, parts of his seems to be a bit too exaggerated, and that's how a few scholars don't take his travelogue data very serious. But K. Nilakanta Shastri has quoted him also, wherein he says, when there was a person who was found guilty of an offense, the court and the coachman got to punish him, and this punishment seemed to have also involved giving him, tying him to a wooden frame and giving him blows with sticks. 50 blows and 60 blows or 100 blows with sticks. That is probably how close a scenario that you can closely resembles the concept of a police station, where you are remanded and you have to be safeguarded. That is one part, and if there is a need to punish and all that becomes a part therein. So this is how close you can go to when it comes to system of policing as such. And as I told you, concept of arresting someone, use of handcuffs, and taking them under control for safety of the society or otherwise, also seems to have been mentioned. And there is one question about covering South, but what was the legal systems existing in North, East, and West a good 1,000 years back? One thing about the other parts of India, but for South India, is that major parts of epigraphic data has been lost due to continuous invasions starting from the 13th century or a little before that also there, several centuries before that. In fact, in the 13th century, it was here in the South. But invasions from other countries, Islamic invasions and other things have happened several centuries before. So a lot of inscriptional data has been lost. A good amount of it has been lost. So we have to depend on secondary source of information and other texts like travelogues, for example, to reconstruct the system. But I'll have to look out more specific and find out data where there is something good enough to be available to present something like this as such. So not just the legal systems, many aspects of social life, religious life, and all that, inscriptions, majority of it has been lost because temples served as document rooms. Inscriptional records were all a part of temples, and of course we all know how we've lost good amount of them. Several hundreds of them, if not thousands, were demolished and brought down. So while there are records about the demolitions of these temples and other things, we should accept the fact that records that were a part of the temple and existing temple system should have been lost too. So I'm falling short of data really to comment as to how exactly it looked. But if you want to know, you will have to depend on secondary sources like quotations of those available in other texts or travelogue documents and other things. So those are the prominent questions that I see here.
In fact, if we are taking up other parts of India, northern, eastern, western India, that will be for another day of topic of discussion.
Probably,
and we would like to make this platform for you to come and present it for our audience.
My pleasure. That would be.
Yeah.
I'm happy to have been a part of it and to follow your YouTube channel also, the APLC's YouTube channel. It's a privilege. I suggest other friends here also to follow it. And if there are any questions to me personally, yes, I will probably share my email ID, and you can feel free, or my social media Twitter handle or my Facebook page, Madhusudanan Kalaichelman. That's where you can find it. Feel free to post your questions there also or inbox me. I'll be more than happy to reply to it. Thank you, Anandji, for the wonderful opportunity. This is a very a topic that I have not commonly attempted so far. It's all been temples and associated activities that I have been presenting on, but to take something specific as legal systems that prevailed 1,000 years back was new to me. And I think I used the opportunity, given the time that I had in hand because of the lockdown, to do some research on that and present 6 cases that I thought were unique and interesting, and to bust a few myths as to the prevalence of a societal system where everybody didn't have a participation on these. I think that needs to be understood that as false statements, and that representation, especially when it comes to social decisions to be taken or welfare of a society and other things, people from various walks of life find mention in epigraphic records to be present.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for participating in our webinar. It is a great honor for us to host you in this program. Only one thing which I would like to tell and close the this webinar is, one thing which we have found in your interaction is the justice system, the dispensing of the justice was very, very quick as compared to the time taken for the due process of law to get completed in this present Indian judiciary system. That is the one biggest takeaway which we can surely think as what we had during the Cholas time, Imperial Cholas time.
Yes.
And
that's probably the profit of having something like Gram Swaraj, as you pointed out. It's a very small system and easy to get your justice.
Yes. And in fact, we are very privileged to have born in this era where advocates have been given an opportunity to represent our clients. If we would have been in that Imperial Chola era, I do not know, God only knows what would have happened to us, a larger section of advocate community. Yeah. And
Fine.
I once again
thank
you very much, Professor, for this wonderful session. And I also thank all the participants for patiently listening to this. And there are other exciting webinars coming up. And we are having the 10th webinar of our series coming up. And shortly we'll be releasing our posters. And do subscribe to our channel, AP Legal Chambers. And also follow us in Facebook for getting updates on the latest videos and the posters. Thank you very much. It is Anand signing off on behalf of AP Legal Chambers and my personal behalf. Have a great week. Thank you.